Welcome to Man Up, the podcast by men, about men, and for men who are striving to be better fathers, husbands, leaders, and followers of Jesus. Are you ready? Man up.
Yes, sir!
Welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Boldman, and this is Man Up, your podcast with the encouragement that you need to be a better father, husband, leader, and follower of Jesus. We're a band of brothers, we're soldiers, we're comrades in arms. We fight side by side, shoulder to shoulder, hand over hand, and mile after mile until each has helped the others attain the high calling of Jesus. And today we are joined by our good friend and has multi-episode contributor, BJ Sipe. I was just on BJ's podcast. What was that, last week, BJ, that I was on the Set Your Mind Above podcast, and I had a lot of fun recording with him. And I asked him at the time if he would come on Man Up and talk to us about self-control. So before we get into that, BJ, how you doing, buddy?
Hey, I'm doing great, Jared. It's great to get to come back over to your side. I really appreciate you coming over and spending some time with us on the Set Your Mind Above podcast. Jared, you shared some excellent things. I've gotten wonderful feedback from everybody about that interview, and so I just want to again thank you so much for that. But it was a huge contribution and is bearing a lot of fruit already. So thank you for that.
That's awesome. I love hearing that, as opposed to, could you never have that guy back?
You know that Jared guy? I liked your other interviews, but let's not return them.
Exactly. He's a little weird, BJ.
You know, those Oregon people, man, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's those Texan people you got to watch out.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I've already been informed that I talk about Texas way too much to ever be an Oregonian, and I'm okay with that.
Well, I got told I look like a Texan today. I've got my plaid shirt, tucked into my jeans, and then I've got my Western boots on today. So
it's even maroon and white. So
College Station.
You do kind of look like you do kind of look like you're rooting for Texas A&M, which it's for about 75% of Texas. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Oh,
although they aren't the pointed toes though. These are the rounded ostrich skin boots. But.
Well, those are real boots.
Yeah, real boots, not pretend boots.
Cowboys had rounded or squared toes. They didn't have these fancy dress boot pointed toes.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, buddy. So on this podcast, as I've been telling the guys for the past few weeks, we're really focusing on fatherhood, and that's the niche that we're going for. That's who we're really speaking to. And when I ask you to come on, I ask you to talk about self-control. And I know you've done a lot of good work with men developing good habits, particularly in the areas of lust and pornography and trying to overcome those things. And so I don't really have a lot of set questions I want to ask you. I just want to have a conversation about self-control and men specifically developing self-control. And let's start out with just a really general question. When you think about men and self-control, particularly in our roles as fathers, where do you see men lacking the most when it comes to self-control?
Oh, I've been thinking about myself since we talked last week, and I look at my life as a father and the things that I personally lack in self-control. I can try to project and think about other men and people that I've talked to, but I want to talk about myself first. And I think one of the things that I struggle with the most as a father, ironically, is when I asked you what would be the bit of advice that you'd give to a father. On our podcast last week, you came back and you said something to the effect of that it's not about you. And when it comes to self-control in our lives, and I think about my life as a father, whether it's discipline or whether it is any other element of me interacting as a father with my children, what I recognize is how often I can make it about myself. And that's where we really lack in our self-control. If I'm disciplining my son, am I really trying to make him more like Jesus? Or is it because he's irritated me or he's frustrated me with something that's about myself? And then I act out in a way that, I don't have control over my voice, or I don't have control over, how I interact with him in that moment. When I think about myself personally, what I recognize, bottom line, is that many times when I'm struggling with self-control, it's because I am not considering the situation and how can I make my children more like Jesus. I've turned it
Mhm.
to something about myself. And I don't recognize it in the moment until I step back, remove myself from the situation, or have my wife, as you know, our wives are our best helpmeets, and says, I don't know if you handled that correctly. And she's right 100% of the time. And I have to listen to her. But when I think about other men, where we lack, especially in self-control, when it comes to fatherhood, there's several things that pop up in my mind. We live in a culture here in this part of Kentucky that I'm from. There is a lot of abuse in this part of and for whatever reason, in this area that we're in, abuse is something that takes place frequently. And you have to start asking the question, why is that the case? And what
Right.
I'm recognizing is kind of goes back to what Peter says in 2 Peter when he's talking about the different virtues that we're to add. And he goes through and he says, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with goodness, goodness with knowledge, knowledge with self-control, self-control with endurance, endurance with godliness, godliness with brotherly affection, brotherly affection with love. Lack of knowledge results in lack of self-control. And when I think about the abusive situation that so many families find themselves in, they don't know any better. There is a place where they are repeating the actions that have been demonstrated to them, modeled for them, and then that's what they go through and they practice
Mhm.
themselves. There is not a level of self-control that has been demonstrated for them. There's not knowledge of a better way to do it. And so they just are repeating the pattern, repeating the very thing that has been done to them in their life. And it's easy to see it in like a very big way like that. But then you turn it on ourselves. And while, we're not abusive towards our children, I know I'm not abusive towards my children. A lot of the times the things that I do that are wrong, I recognize the reason I do them is because that has been what's been modeled for me. We aren't
Sure.
growing in our knowledge of fatherhood. We just go into it thinking that we're going to, figure it out as we go. And as a
Uh-huh.
result, we don't equip ourselves with self-control.
That brings up an interesting thought to me. Um, and this goes in a couple of different directions. And the first thing is when you were talking about knowledge there, oftentimes we think about self-control being changing behaviors. That if I want to be a better father, then I'm going to change my behavior. It's not really about changing your behavior. And I think to your point when you hearkened back to our conversation last week on your podcast, that it's not about changing your behavior. It starts with a change of perspective.
Yes.
That I can't I'm not going to change my behavior and stay on the same course and succeed at being a better father when it comes to discipline. And it's not about moderation. It's not about lowering the frequency of whatever event that we're trying to exercise self-control in. It's about changing the expectations that we have for ourselves. And that sort of gets to one of my pet peeves. And I think for a lot of men it's a pet peeve. The idea that masculinity is inherently toxic. I feel like toxic masculinity, if such a thing actually exists, and I'm going to be talking to Stoneheart and Embry tomorrow, so that'll be a fun conversation because I know Keith is not a huge fan of that term, toxic masculinity. But it seems like to me that if toxic masculinity actually does exist, it comes not from the discipline side of masculinity where men are denying themselves, lifting up others' burdens, taking care of what they need to take care of. It really comes from almost a self-fulfilling prophecy of a lack of self-control.
Mm-hmm.
That if you look at toxic masculinity is really a selfish version of masculinity that's sort of come about because we've started labeling everything as toxic. Well, this is toxic or this is toxic. Well, I'm just going to rebel against that. I can't do anything and be a man, so I'm going to be the worst version of myself that I can be and rage against the machine kind of thing. Oftentimes, that lack of knowledge that lack of perspective that you were just talking about really does add to that or contributes rather to that cycle
Yes.
that we're trying to break. And if we don't gain some perspective that I'm not, what the world thinks about me as a man doesn't matter. It's, am I following the pattern? And if I'm so caught up in what the world thinks about me that I never stop and ask, am I following the pattern? Then I'm not going to be someone who is a man of self-control in any area of my life. So what are some, I'm going to let you talk. I talked for about 3 minutes. I'm going to let you talk a little bit about that.
I love the conversation, and we need that back and forth here.
So when you think about men in general and some of the things that men in particular struggle with, I know you've helped a lot of men with things like overcoming lust or dealing with lust. I don't know
Right.
that men, we can ever say we really overcome lust.
Sure.
Overcoming the struggle that a lot of men have with pornography, which is, there's a lot more men that struggle with that than will admit to the fact that they struggle with that.
Right.
You think about that and you think about how, again, self-control can't be a lessening of a behavior. It can't be a moderation. It's got to be a change. It's got
Right.
to inherently be a change. When you think about that and you think about the role of a father, and you mentioned those cycles of abuse, what do you think the first step is? I mean, as somebody who's helped a lot of men deal with lust and pornography, and then you were talking about abuse there in your area of the world, which I don't think is common to just any one area of the
Sure.
world or any one demographic, but it's something that you see in the area that you're laboring in. What do you think the first step is? BJ Sipe is sitting down and talking with somebody about abuse or lust or pornography or any area where men need to learn to control themselves. What is the first step in breaking a cycle?
Yeah. So I'm a little bit about my background for those that might not know it. So I was addicted to pornography for a decade of my life, and really, really distorted all of my relationships. Of course, it destroyed my relationship with the Lord, destroyed all of my dating relationships. If I can go back and change everything, I would. But what I can do now is do my best to try to help other men who have struggled with these issues and show them hope. Because I think that's where I want to start with anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Where does it begin? The first, what we're ultimately working towards, and so I'll talk about this in a second, is renewing our mind. Okay? You have to renew your mind. You have to let the Spirit work on your heart if you are actually going to make a permanent change. It's not about behavior modification. We're talking about heart modification, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that starts, it's going to be a lot of things to stop believing many of the lies that we've bought into that we don't realize, and embracing the truths within God's Word, getting a healthy view of sexuality, a godly view of sexuality, all these kinds of things. But I think where it begins is hope. And here's what I mean by that. When you're talking about abuse, or when you're talking about pornography or sex addiction or even drug addiction, you sit across the table from someone, and many times the reason that there is not a desire to exercise self-control even is that they don't believe that they can. There is a legitimate belief that this is who they are. that this is what they're always going to struggle with, that they do not have the power to overcome. And the reality is, yeah, by yourself, you don't. You're right. And if you continue in the same, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, right? And that is where so many men are. They have embraced an identity that this is who I am, right? I am my
Right.
father, or I am this, or I am a druggie, I am an alcoholic. And that's even pumped into people, who are trying to go to an organization, a program that are trying to deliver them, from slavery to alcohol. They have to embrace, like, this is my identity. I am this. There's a lot of harm
Right.
actually behind that mentality. And that's where I came from. I came from a perspective where I thought, this is just who I am. Like, I have done so much damage. I have, such a draw to, sexual perversion in my life that this is always who I'm going to be. And you have to sit down and help someone paint the picture for them to actually stop believing that lie and believe that there is hope, that there is a different way, and that they can overcome through the Holy Spirit and through the gospel of Christ and through renewal of the mind. But the very first place you have to start with is hope. Because if you don't give someone hope, if you don't give someone incentive, there's not going to be any desire to change, to go forward.
Right. And that's an interesting way of looking at it, because I think a lot of people, the first step is admitting that you have a problem. And I think sometimes if you don't show people hope, they have a hard time admitting that they have a problem, because like you said, it is their identity. It's not something they're doing. It's not something they're struggling with. It is their identity. And if you don't show them that hope, they may never come to that. But it also speaks to this sort of Western ethos that we have of, when you have a problem, you just sort of, tough it up and gut it out and quit cold turkey, or, whatever phrase you want to use for overcoming by the sheer strength of will. You don't get there, again, by changing the behavior. I like how you use the idea of renewing your mind, that I've got to change my mindset. If a man is struggling, if he's got this dependency on whatever it is, if he is struggling to put down the pornography, or if he is struggling to build a better relationship with his wife that's not based on physical or emotional abuse, you have to start with the fact that that's not where you want to be, and that's not who you are.
Right.
And if you don't start from that point, you're just changing your behavior.
Right.
And I think for a lot of men, changing the behavior feels enough. It feels like it's enough. We kind of approach it with the same mentality of that we do, I don't know, any other chore that we would take on. I took out the trash. Well, I stopped doing this. Well, okay, well, you stopped doing that, but is your mind different? Because it is really easy to fall back into those addictive patterns.
Well, and on that,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to switch topics. So if you got something else, jump on it.
On that note, you think about what Jesus says to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. And he says in verse 25, he says, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup so that the outside may also become clean." Jesus gives the pattern here. And what we realize is that so many of us, we don't think of ourselves as Pharisees, but we put on the mask as men. You just, like you said, this Western mentality, is tough it out, just deal with it, just behavior modification.
Rub some dirt in it and gut it out.
Yeah, I'm fine. I got it. No. We have become hypocrites. We become actors, and we just try to force and change behavior modification without changing the heart, without changing the mind, and that does not lead to lasting fix. So, like, let's take pornography, for example. You get so many guys that they do well for a couple weeks, a couple months, maybe a couple years, and then they're right back into it. And they can never give it up. Why? Because you're not making lasting, permanent change. You have to change the inside in order to change the outside, in order to establish self-control. It's not something that we can do apart from the Holy Spirit. And when you see every time that Paul is going to deal with put off and put on, any type of, instruction about our behavior, look in the context, and you're going to recognize right before that, Paul deals with the mind somewhere. Paul deals with renewing the mind before he deals with our actions, with the way that we behave. And that's exactly what you would expect from someone who received his gospel from Christ, because that's the gospel that Jesus preached.
Yeah, who had so much to put off and put on. And I mean, you think about Philippians and you think about how much, Paul went through there, and he attributes everything that he put off as a change of mind, that he wanted to gain the knowledge of Christ. He wanted to lay hold of the resurrection of Christ. And that perspective change, that desire for outcome, that desire to model Jesus in our life, or model the change that Jesus would have us make in our lives, that's really the essence of what we're talking about.
Yes.
For a lot of guys, these changes, particularly when it comes to things like dealing with lust or dealing with pornography, or maybe even dealing with abuse, we tend to want to make these changes when big moments in our life come. That we think, when I get married, then I'll stop looking at pornography, or when my kids are born, then I'll make some kind of big change. Too late, too soon, or as good a time as any?
Yeah. When you start setting a timeline, like this is when I'm going to, you've already set yourself up for failure, right? Because you're not going, that's like saying, well, I'm going to repent at a more convenient time. What makes you think that suddenly you're going to have the kind of faith and the kind of heart then that's actually going to do that adequately? Like what we're talking about is just behavior modification. Again, what you're saying is I'm going to change my behavior here. But you're not changing your heart. If you actually understood what you were doing, where you were coming from, and where you were at, you would submit now. You would make changes now because of the serious nature in which you are being, you recognize that you're in, the position that you recognize that you're in. What we're getting it to the heart here of is really how we approach so many of our issues when it comes to our walk with Christ. We are dealing with the lordship of Jesus. Jesus is not the Lord of your life unless he is Lord of all of your life. Okay?
Yeah.
That includes the way that I think. That includes the way that I walk. That includes the way that I talk. And so many times we play this role where we try to serve two masters. And Jesus said that you can't do that. You will either hate one and love the other, or serve one and despise the other. And we have deceived ourselves into thinking that we are still being pleasing to Christ so long as, I give him most of my life, but I'll give him the rest of it at this point, or at this point, or at this point. No, you won't. You never will, if that's my mentality now. You have to make a decision. I am going to let Jesus be the Lord of my life over all of my life. And it's not until I make that decision that he will ever truly become my Lord.
Well, and doesn't that take us right back to the difference between changing actions and changing your mind?
Yes.
That, having Jesus be the Lord of my life doesn't just mean that I'm behaving better. In some cases, it means that I'm seeing even more things that I struggle with. I know that's one of the things that my buddy Brian and we're going to talk about in a Biblically Speaking podcast, the other podcast that I do, in a few weeks, is does Jesus demand perfection or does he demand diligence? And the idea that we can fool ourselves into feeling like we are the perfection based on what we're doing, and what we're really missing is the diligence to keep working through things that are areas of our life where we're constantly under assault or stumbling or struggling with. And the fact of the matter is that we're never perfect apart from Christ. And when we fool ourselves into thinking that if I just change this one behavior and I'll do that when I'm past this event, or
Right.
I'm out of this stressful moment, and
Mm-hmm.
and that always seems to sort of be, I think, a trigger when it comes from men. I mean, one of the things I talked a lot about on this program and the Biblically Speaking podcast is anger. Anger is something that I've struggled with my whole life. Not overly emotional outbursts of anger. I just enjoy being angry. I'm one of those people that being angry feels good. It feels powerful. It feels, sometimes it makes me feel like I have control over a situation when everybody else doesn't know what to do. If I get angry enough, I feel like I have control. When in reality, I probably have the least amount of control that I would ever
Yeah.
have. And knowing that, I know that I can't indulge in a little bit of anger because I start to view the world in a very negative way. I start
Right.
to view people's motives in a very negative way. It changes my relationship with them, and therefore it's changing my relationship with
Mm-hmm.
everything in my life. And my son can tell me, because, Dad, what are you angry about? And I'm not angry. He goes, no, you are. Your tone has changed, and he can see it coming before I can see it coming. And what that tells me, again, is it is not about just stopping certain behaviors. It's about changing my approach, my demeanor, my
Yep.
outlook toward all the things that are going on in my life. That's kind of a sobering recognition when you
Right.
stop and think about it, that oftentimes as men, our kids see our struggles, and particularly with something like anger or like pornography, where maybe we're passing that on, if we're not careful, to the next generation. And pornography, I think, is not that I'm grading on a scale or anything, but pornography is really detrimental, I think, because it affects our sons and daughters differently. It can affect
Yep.
our sons in a way that to think that this is something that's normal that I should go out and seek. It can affect our daughters. For those of us that have daughters, I don't. I've got one son, but it can affect their self-image, their body image, their relationship with men in general, and oftentimes that lack of self-control, that one of the lies that we tell ourselves is that if it's not physically hurting them, then it's causing no harm. That this is just my problem, it's my cross, it's my burden to bear. What are some of the ramifications that come about through the addictions that we're talking about, trying to break the cycle of and gain some control over? What are some of the ramifications on the next generation as we're thinking about being fathers?
Oh man, how long do you got?
As long as you want, buddy. I can always cut it down.
Yeah, that's true. Sin never just impacts yourself. It never does.
Mm-hmm.
It will always, have an impact on the next generation, and it is a snowball effect. It is
Mm-hmm.
going to get progressively worse. The issues become progressively worse. The damage that it does increases with every passing generation. Okay. And here's what, let's just take, with my background with pornography and the damage that it does. You
Mm-hmm.
spoke to this just a little bit. So I have 2 daughters and I have 1 son.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take pornography and whether it's something that my son or my daughters end up viewing, the very fact that it exists, the very fact that the standards that we have exist are already making an impact on my children, right? Satan is going
Mm-hmm.
to attack them whether they view it or not. And he
Yeah.
is teaching my children, he's teaching my son through the world that women are something to be used, that to be objectified, that they are here for your pleasure and for your partnership. And what is teaching my daughters is that your worth and your value is found in your appearance and in your looks and in the way that you give yourself over to men and seek their approval. this is what I've found. And this is not the direction I think you probably thought I was going to go, but this is where I want to start. Every
Okay.
time I sit down and I talk with a young man, and I'm going to talk with a new young man today after we're all done, and this is the very first question that I'm going to ask him. This is the very first question I ask anybody. How was sex viewed and discussed in your home? You know what the number one answer is in almost every single situation?
It wasn't.
Yeah, that it was not. The number one
Mm-hmm.
answer is that it was not discussed. It was a taboo subject.
Yep.
And so what we think is, well, even if this is the lie we tell ourselves, well, I'm not viewing pornography, right? I'm not struggling with it. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's not a problem in my house. Yes, it is. Whether you're viewing it
Mm-hmm.
or not, it is a problem because if I am not teaching my children a godly view of sexuality and our value and our
Mm-hmm.
identity, if I'm not teaching my son how to view women, um, and I'm not teaching my daughters how to view themselves and what to expect from a real man and how to be treated,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to get answers from the world if I don't give it to them.
Yeah.
If I don't teach them a godly view of sexuality, they will learn it from someone that is not godly or from somewhere that is not godly. And so
Mm-hmm.
these issues already are having an impact on our children, even if they are not present in our home. And so I wanted to make that very clear to start. This is not something that just pertains to men who have struggled with pornography or any other kind of issue, addiction, abuse, any of these kinds of things. These are issues that affect every single household, and we need to start talking about them now. We need to prepare our children now. Now, that being said, if they are present in our household, you are going to create core memories with your children, things that they will not forget in a very negative sense, in a very negative way. Your children
Mm-hmm.
will not forget the first time they remember, you know, mommy and daddy, fighting about this issue. They will not
Yeah.
forget the time that they saw dad looking at another naked woman on TV. They will not forget the time in an abusive situation, they will not forget the time that they saw dad coming down the hallway after mom or whatever it is. These things
Yeah.
make a lasting impression on our children. They set the standard for how our children learn a husband is supposed to behave or a father is supposed to behave. And even if we are teaching them one thing from our mouths, that is not what they're going to follow. The idea of do what I say, not what
Right.
I do, falls flat. If we want to teach our children, it begins with what we're actually doing. Charles Spurgeon was quoted saying, train up a child in the way he should go, but make sure you're going that way yourself. And of course, he's citing the proverb, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. But Charles Spurgeon makes the
Mm-hmm.
correct point. That involves me actually modeling it first. Being a father, being a husband, it is not about me teaching the right things, saying the right things to my children. It is about living out the gospel in a way that models for them what it looks like. If you want your children to have self-control, that needs to be modeled for your children. If you
Mm-hmm.
want your children to become believers, that needs to be modeled for your children. If we want our children to become loving, husbands and loving, submissive wives or whatever it might be, that needs to be modeled for your children. Everything begins
Right.
with our action. And in a positive way and in a negative way. But we need to recognize the negative way. You are going to have a profound impact on the way that your child behaves and views these issues if these are a part of your life and if you have not allowed Christ to be the Lord of all of your life. and your children are going to walk in the ways that more than likely that you're walking yourself. It's going to impact every area of their life.
That sort of brings me into maybe a separate sidecar that I want to talk a little bit about. And it sort of goes back to something I was asking you about earlier about how, taking our definitions of what is masculine and what is not masculine from society can be self-fulfilling. That basically, in a lot of ways, I think the explosion of toxic masculinity, if that exists in our culture, is because we spent so many years labeling people as toxic that they just kind of swerved into it. That a lot of the things that we're talking about being in control over and developing measures of self-control over are becoming, not all of them, I mean, obviously abuse is not one, but are becoming socially acceptable. I was looking at a study the other day that was talking about the change in how people think about pornography, that pornography used to be seen as really shady and dark and sort of the underbelly of society. And now, any man or woman can go out and get themselves an OnlyFans account, which is basically everyday people, selling naked pictures and videos of themselves online. And it's developed an acceptability in our culture. Drug use has certainly developed an acceptability in our culture. I mean, I live in Portland, even drug abuse has developed an acceptability or an acceptance in our culture, that so many of these things, if we take our cues for what is right and what is wrong and what areas I need to exercise some self-control in and what areas I need to just deny myself, if we're taking those cues from society, then we're in a dangerous position there. That I mean, it kind of goes without saying, but I mean, not all of our audience are Christians, but when it comes right down to it, society is pushing certain things to become more acceptable. My wife showed me an article the other day about how they were, and I'll use the initials CP. You can figure out what it is based on the context, but how certain people were using AI to get around the CP laws and share illicit images of children that were generated by computers, that a lot of the faces of those people were faces of actual people who were trafficked. And so here you have people who the law doesn't technically know how to deal with this. And it is something that is emerging into our culture as no one's getting harmed by this. And I think you spoke to that point brilliantly when you talked about you're affecting your children one way or the other. Guys, we got to draw a line. We've got to draw lines that you're going to have to decide in a man up kind of way. You're going to have to draw your line on what kind of man you're going to be.
Yes.
That when it comes to sexual material, you're either in it or you're not. That there's no, I'm going to dip my toe in the water because nobody's getting hurt, or this is acceptable because this is just a woman who's trying to make some extra money and she's got just a regular, normal, everyday life and nobody's getting harmed with this. You're harming yourself. You're harming your relationship with God. You're harming your relationship with your children. You're harming your relationship with your spouse. You're affecting, if you're not married, what your future relationship with your spouse is going to look like. I mean, BJ, you spoke to that when you talked about pornography and how it affects dating and marriage. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? How do we sort of get out of the mindset that society isn't shocked by this, no one's harmed by this? How do we break that line of thinking?
Yeah. Whenever someone says, no one is being hurt, first of all, what standard are you using, right? Because the only way you can make that claim, number one, is if you remove every spiritual element of what's taking place. Because obviously the spiritual ramifications of what we're doing creates the greatest harm, which is separation from God. Sin destroys our relationship with God.
Yeah.
And condemns us. And so right there, we already have a problem with that claim. But let's even go further. We live in a culture, Jared, that wants to ignore facts and figures for what makes me feel right. Really what the claim is saying, it's not actually making the claim is not intended to say, no one is hurt, because the facts speak differently, right? You look at the effects of pornography on children. You look at the effects of what it does to their brain, and the addiction to dopamine and how it destroys the prefrontal cortex, which is the judgment center of the brain, and the highways that it creates to hypersexualize everything. You are doing...
Well, in many ways, we're destroying those judgment centers before they're even fully formed.
Exactly, because the prefrontal cortex
doesn't... Yeah.
Doesn't develop until you're
like 25, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so there is it is one of those things that it is so obvious and yet neglected. It's a willful ignorance of that which is factual in order to pursue that which makes me feel good. I want to justify what I want to do, a very, relativism, postmodern approach that, no one has the right to tell me I'm not right. If it feels good, then it is good, and no one has a right to tell me any different. And so the claim that it doesn't hurt anybody is a willfully ignorant claim. It's someone that does not want to deal with the ramifications, the actual, not just science, but the realities around them of how this is affecting others. And that's just the definition of selfishness. And so, honestly, the answer goes back to what we started at. We've got to renew the mind. You've got to renew the heart. The answer is the gospel, because someone will not have a desire to no longer be selfish unless they give their life over to the Lord, right? The gospel is the answer to that, problem. But I do want to say this. So let's just stick with, sex addiction and the issues that immorality brings to our life. When you start to actually think about, okay, this doesn't affect anybody, this doesn't impact anybody, let's talk about that. Proverbs 5, written by Solomon, and if anyone knew the ramifications of sexual immorality, I would guess it would be Solomon, being someone who had, 400 wives and 500 prostitutes and concubines or whatever it was. Look at what he says in Proverbs 5. In verse 7, he says, "So now, sons, listen to me. Do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from here, and do not go near the door of her house. Otherwise, you will give up your vitality to others, and your years to someone cruel. You will drain your resources, and your hard-earned pay will end up in a foreigner's house, and at the end of your life you will lament when your physical body has been consumed. And you say, how I hated discipline, and how my heart despised correction. I did not obey my teachers or listen closely to my instructors. I am on the verge of complete ruin before the entire community." There's so much that we can unpack there that we just don't have time to do right now in this podcast, but I want you to recognize this reality. In the world that we live in, it takes years to build something, but it takes just a moment to destroy it. That's the reality with anything. If you want to build a building, it takes careful planning and laying a proper foundation and, erecting that building. But an earthquake comes through or a tornado comes through, and what took years to build is destroyed in a matter of seconds. A flower, you plant a seed. My son, I'll tell on my son right now. We've got raised beds, and my son is 3 years old, for context. And if you took Dennis the Menace and Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes and merged them together, that's my son. He is all boy.
Oh, he's all boy.
Oh, yeah. And I love him to death, but man, he's all boy. So Kylie has worked really hard on our garden, and you go out and you plant and you water and you get the right soil, and we had to build these raised boxes and put them in the right space and make sure they're getting enough sun and all this work. And we finally start
places to drive your Tonka trucks.
We finally start having fruit being produced. And my son goes over there and, well, he sees, there's these green tomatoes. So what does he do? He goes and picks every single one of them off before they're ready and ripe. And you're like, no, son, we had all of this. Like, oh my goodness, we've been working towards getting fruit and now it's destroyed because of a decision that he made. And while it's a good teaching moment for my son, here's an example of taking an everyday, ordinary event and using it to teach an extraordinary eternal truth like we do on the Set Your Mind Above podcast. That is a commentary on what happens with sexual immorality. It takes years to build a reputation. It takes years to build a marriage. And all of that work that you've done can be destroyed with one decision. What takes years to build takes seconds to destroy.
I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions based on that. And I want to go back a minute or so ago when you were talking about how early introduction to this, and I don't even think it has to be pornography. I think early contemplation of the sexual relationship. And this is coming from the guy that I frequently say, when you think it's time to start the ball game of talking to your kids about sex, the devil's already got the runner on second. In some cases, the base is loaded. But do you feel like there's an agenda in our culture to bring sexual things to children early because it shapes the way they think about certain lifestyles and behaviors?
If you don't believe that's true, you need to go on YouTube and look up different school board meetings with parents and recognize what is being taught to our children at an early age in so many different school, regions. I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. School districts. And there are so many, and this is not getting into a public school versus homeschool thing. What I'm telling parents is you need to be aware of how Satan is going to use so many different avenues to try and impact your children. There's absolutely an agenda. The kind of books that are available in your library at your kid's school that they can go check out without your knowledge would absolutely blow your mind. Things that are instructing your children how to experiment sexually. Things that a fourth grader or a third grader could go check. And you just go on YouTube and you look up these different, parents that are fighting with school boards and meetings, and they're bringing up the same kind of books, the same kinds of titles, the same kinds of agendas all across the United States. It's happening all across, from west to east. There is absolutely an agenda, because here's what it is. You start early. And it's happening even in your own home. Let's say, well, I homeschool my kids. Well, what are you allowing your children to intake on social media or on television? Things that you think are safe. The Disney Channel is full of all kinds of trying to program, our children to think a certain way about different lifestyles and reject what the Lord, has said. You look at it in, there's all sorts of titles I can bring up. The newest Buzz Lightyear movie. Of course, there's same-sex relationships in the newest Buzz Lightyear movie. We were watching Dino Ranch the other day, and we had to skip an episode, and we stopped watching that show altogether because there's, Adoptosaurus Rex, and it's two daddy dinosaurs that want to adopt an egg together. And this show is directed towards 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds and under. There is, the new Jedi show for kids, and the same thing is there. And so all of this, it's everywhere you look. It's in public schools. It is on television. And what people recognize and know is that if you start young, if you change their mind, orient them away from a Godward orientation and towards a secular, worldly orientation, to buy into those lies, that they will not only endorse those lifestyles, normalize those lifestyles, but contribute to those lifestyles. And it ultimately ends up feeding the monster of what this is all about, behind June and everything going on with the LGBTQ community and support, these companies don't care at all about the rights of,
Right.
homosexuality. What they care about is dollars. What they care about is money.
Yeah.
What they care about is power. What this comes down to is people are trying to control our children because it fuels their agenda, it fuels their ability to remain in power.
Yeah. So let me ask this as a second follow-up question. I mean, we live in a world where two-parent same-sex households are reality. I mean, your kids are going to encounter that whether they're in public school or homeschool. How do we teach our kids that that's not what God wants? Those are not people that we hate, but it's also going to be something that you're going to encounter. How do we walk that line? Because, I mean, it's out there. And to some degree, I think, let me preface that a little bit more by saying I think our culture even is pushing back against some of this because of the massive failures of the Anheuser-Busch Company and Ford Motor Company and Disney and several Target, several other major brands have really taken it on the chin for pushing this too far.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the LGB side of the LGBTQIA is trying to uncouple themselves from the targeting of children with the transgendered agenda because they'll now say, well, that's not where we ever intended this to go.
Mm-hmm.
How do we raise kids in a world where they're going to encounter that? We want them to see people that are engaged in that as people that can be led to Christ. That change in behavior, change in mind is going to have to happen, but it's also not what God authorized. I mean,
Right.
To some degree, I guess you could say it's no different than being from kids being from a household where there's been unscriptural divorce and remarriage. How do we model that for kids?
Right. Well, it begins by not teaching them that the answer is, anger or vindictive or boycotts or, political in nature. The
It's
answer
almost like you've listened to a couple of episodes.
it may be, but it's a point that needs to be reduplicated.
Yeah.
How are you caring for someone's soul by saying that that's the answer? You're not.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the point. Okay. 2 Timothy 2, beginning verse 24. The Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness, that perhaps God may grant them repentance, after being captured by the devil and escape his snare, after being captured by him to do his will. When you look at everything that Paul says there to Timothy, and I didn't read that, I was just citing it from memory, so it might not be word for word. But when you look at what Paul says there to Timothy, one, don't be quarrelsome. The number one issue I see that's a problem with Christians when dealing with this issue is they just want to fight. They don't want to actually win a soul. They don't want to have an intellectual conversation. They also don't want to listen. They just want to fight. They feel like they've done their part. I've done my job for God. I've stood up and I've posted a picture about the rainbow really means this on Facebook, and so I've done my part. I'm standing up for truth. Well, one, you need to listen to start with. I need to educate myself to learn what's the difference between same-sex attraction, same-sex practice, same-sex orientation, all these different kinds of things. I need to listen because what you're going to find, number one, is that I've made a lot of assumptions about things. I need to listen to where people are coming from, to listen for their brokenness, to listen to what it is that they're seeking to start with. Because here's the deal. Everyone's looking for all the same things, and we just happen to look for them in all the wrong places. We do not recognize our own brokenness and our need for the gospel. I am just as in much desperate need for salvation and in need of the grace of Jesus Christ in my life as is someone who comes from the background of a homosexual, orientation and relationship. We both need
Right.
Jesus, and both of us are lost without Christ. And so what needs to be taught to our children is you need to model what Paul tells Timothy, that I'm not going to be quarrelsome. I'm not going to politicize this. This is a spiritual issue. This is a heart issue. This is a hope issue. And I need to show kindness and gentleness while standing for what's right and teaching truth. But it needs to be done in humility, remembering where I come from as well. And it's not about us versus them. It's about one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread.
Amen. Let me ask you this question, and this is going to dovetail right off what you were just saying there. You were talking about modeling examples of self-control. Let's go back to the one we've been talking about most for this past hour, the controlling sexual urges, controlling lust, controlling getting control of that before we start engaging in things like pornography or illicit sex or things of that nature. We just said that our world absolutely has an agenda, and that agenda is driven by money. That agenda is driven by wanting to normalize certain behaviors. So what strategies do you use, on a regular basis to model self-control for your children when it comes to these issues? How do we teach this kind of self-control? We talked about breaking the cycle of abuse earlier and sort of becoming in control of ourselves. What strategies do we use to teach self-control in this arena or in these areas to our children?
Oh, that's one I'm still trying to figure out, if I'm being perfectly honest with you.
Come on, man. Yeah, I think we all are.
As a
I think
young
we all
father.
are. But I mean, let me give you a prime example of what I'm talking about. You're
Sure.
walking through a shopping mall,
Yeah.
scantily clad woman standing in a window or a picture of her. You've got a moment. You got a teaching moment. You got what I call a God moment right there.
Mhm.
What strategies, what conversations are you going to have with your son or your daughter about why you turned your head, why it's important to turn your head? How do you make those age appropriate, and how do you make those lessons stick?
Yeah. Again, things I'm still struggling with and figuring out as a father. But let me go back to a point we made earlier and recenter this.
Okay.
It goes back to Jesus is not the Lord of your life unless he's Lord of all of our life. And here's what I mean by that. Regardless of what I teach my children in that moment, if they don't see it reflected in other areas of my life, my children will see the hypocrisy and not listen to what I have to say. Okay. So let me explain what I'm trying to say. If I, bounce the eyes and tell my children how much we need to, respect women and God, the scantily clad picture at the mall, and say, we shouldn't be looking at these things, and this is why, and this is how God made women and how we're supposed to view them. And then, on the way home, I'm snapping at Kylie and talking poorly to her because I'm frustrated and she didn't show up. She spent too long in a store. Like, what have I just done to my lesson I taught my children, right? This is kind of James' point when he talks about, if you transgress one area of the law, you transgress the whole law. And I'm trying to get to the heart of consistency. And none of us are going to be perfectly consistent. And we need to recognize that. And we need to do our best to accept that, confess that, and share that with our children. And so, to a degree, we need to continue to confess to our children when we struggle ourselves, and that it doesn't change the truths that are concrete, that God is unchanging. While Dad is going to fail in these sometimes, it does not change the truth of this. And so that's where I would begin to start with to answer that question is a given. But as far as specific, strategies in living in this world and how we approach with our children, the number one role that I have as a parent is to help my children to come to know Christ and to seek him as their Lord and to be their Redeemer, and to then turn and not just complete the first part of the greatest commandment to love God in their lives, but to love others, right? And so if all of my teaching of my children is negative. And what I mean by that is do not, do not, do not, do not. Then my children are going to miss the point. I need to model these things in what I should do, right? It's not just that I teach my children, hey, you need to value women, and so don't look at these things. I need to model what that looks like, and how do you actually do that? How do you value women? It's not just by not looking at that, thing at the mall, like the example you brought up. It's through the way that I treat their mom. It's through the way that we treat the widow at church. It's through the way that, I talk about and talk to my daughter about her value in Christ. And all of these things, if we just make it about what we don't do, and it's a continued lecture to our children, they're going to struggle. I need to step out and demonstrate what these things actually look like in my life and how they can do these things themselves. And so I guess that would be, you can get as specific as you want, and we can do that with specific illustrations of the actual how-to, but I think that's the principle that needs to guide us as we talk about this, it is not about do not, do not, do not, do not. I need to be modeling for my children what we should be doing.
Well, and I think that gets to the heart of, a passage like Matthew 16:24, where Jesus says, if anyone's going to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Self-control and self-denial are not the same thing. Self-denial is part of self-control, but self-control is also that response of taking up the cross, bearing the burden and following. And self-control is bigger than just self-denial. In fact, self-denial is just kind of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to self-control. And if we never get past the do not phase and we're not replacing that with something positive, then what we're creating for them is a list of do nots that they're never going to live up to.
Right.
And, don't look at the picture, don't say those words, don't do this. You've got to replace it with something else. You've got to give them an image to conform to. And that sort of goes back to something we were talking about. I don't remember if it was this podcast or the Biblically Speaking. Actually, I think it was your podcast last week.
Yep.
Where we were talking about fathers are the first example of Jesus that children need to see. That's what it means to bring up your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. They need to see that your care and your compassion and your instruction and your correction come from God. They're not coming from your whims. They're not coming from this is wrong in this moment, but it's right in this moment kind of thing. It is, you're consistent in that. So let me ask you one final question and then I'll let you go. You got a new father, and a lot of guys are stepping out of fatherhood. They're delaying fatherhood. In some cases, guys are saying, I don't even want to be a dad because our culture's so messed up right now with the roles of men and women and women sort of men versus women, women versus men. That's sort of infected, I think, the millennial. I think Generation Z may be sort of breaking that mold a little bit, but I think it really hit the millennial generation hard. That this messed up sense of men and women and how they should relate to one another. But you've got somebody who is coming into fatherhood for the first time. They're trapped in some cycle, be it pornography addiction, be it abuse, that they were abused or saw abuse in their household as a child. What advice do you give to new fathers about the importance of self-control and how to break that cycle so that they don't pass those things on to their children? Yeah. I mean, beyond setting your mind above that, what concrete piece of advice are you going to give them?
Romans 1:16 says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation, to those who believe, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. My question would be, do you believe that? Because, where you kind of prefaced that question, whenever someone starts to say, well, we live in this really kind of broken, corrupt, world, just the way that things are going. What I've already said is I don't believe that the gospel is powerful enough to deal with the issues of today. because the issues of today are the same issues as yesterday. And if I don't believe in the power of the gospel, I've missed the point of what it can do to transform. So now to move on to the second part of that, though, with what advice do I give to a father who's about to become a father for the first time about self-control and not handing things down, to the next generation? I think the first thing that I would tell them is you are not going to do it perfectly. You are going to make mistakes. You are going to hurt your children in many ways. My wife has a great joke. She says, and I love it. She says, we need to stop, with the cultural expectation that, parents should pay for their daughter's wedding. We just need to have them pay for their therapy. Because a lot of times we're going to hurt our kids. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to mess them up. And so what I would tell a father who's going to be is, God's grace is still greater. You need to be a model and an example of humility, and you need to demonstrate and show the transforming power of the gospel to your children in your own life. Show them your growth. Show them that you're going to make mistakes, but that you can, move forward. So I don't want to set a wrong expectation and say, hey, here's the magic, words, abracadabra, and then you're going to have a perfect example of self-control. You're never going to mess your kids up. The reality is you are. You're going to hurt your kids. You're going to do things wrong, just like all of us, have experienced in our own lives. We're going to make mistakes. But you need to be the model of humility and to get back up again and to not believe the lie that this is just who I am, and you embrace that and neglect self-control and lordship of Christ. You need to show your children what it means to fight, what it means to deny self, what it means to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling and wrestle with it, because the nature is your children are going to wrestle with it too. They might not struggle with the same issues you're going to struggle with, but they're going to struggle with their own things. And how you deal with your own stuff is going to show them whether or not they should deal with theirs. That would be what I would tell a father, honestly, because reality is you're gonna hurt your kids. You're not going to be perfect because we live in a broken world, but model for them who can mend us together. And that's, again, returning back to the lordship of Christ and going back to him.
So let him see you struggle, the victories you win, be honest about the setbacks and the reason why you're making the changes.
Right. And at the heart of it is Christ, right? Jesus came to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives. He's talking about me. He's talking about the ways that I have destroyed my mind and my heart. He's talking about the slavery that I have found myself in to sin. Jesus came to help redeem me. And I need to communicate to my children that my Lord is their Lord. The only answer is through him too. They need him. I need him. And if I teach anything different than that, I'm really teaching a different gospel. If I'm trying to model and tell them, this is the secret way to have perfect self-control, or to, we start getting into checkbox Christianity that way, and really we set our children up to fail, and they recognize they can't do it and they fall away. I need to set a different model. I need to show them Christ. I need to show them the grace of Christ. I need to show them their need for him. And that begins with realizing and having the expectation, I'm not going to do this perfectly, but that's why there's Jesus.
All right. Well, BJ, thank you for being here today. I think it was a good discussion. I think the guys are going to get a lot out of this one. Self-control is something that we all struggle with, but if you want a little more help with that, you can check out BJ's Set Your Mind Above podcast. That drops every Thursday, doesn't it?
Yep.
All right, so be sure you're looking for that on Thursday. It's available wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. And you can also hear BJ at the Balancing the Christian Life lectureship. I think he is on Friday, July 28th, if memory serves. You're on my track about being good men and godly men, and he's going to be talking about being the husband that our wives deserve and being a good husband and the marriage relationship, something that if you heard him speak about Kylie today, you know that it's something that's on the forefront of his mind. BJ, you got anything else for the guys as we close this out?
I just want to thank you, for the opportunity, and I'll say, I'm a work in progress, just like we all are, and we have been given a great task in our role as fathers. We are to reflect the headship of Jesus Christ, and it's all about Him. It's all about His glory, and so it's not like you said last week, on our podcast. It's not about us. At the end of the day, this is about Christ. And so I would just encourage us fathers, go do that. Go reflect the glory of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Well, thanks again for being with us, buddy. I appreciate that. And thanks to all of you who listen to this podcast. We're growing again by leaps and bounds and gaining new men who are trying to be good and godly fathers in the audience. So be sure to share and subscribe. If you're watching it on the Real Dad channel on YouTube, let us know some episodes in the comments that you would like us to do on what could help you be a better father, or something that you'd like us to look at when it comes to being a godly man. Be sure to leave those ideas in the comments. And for all of us here at the Man Up Podcast, we want to thank you and say have a good day, God bless, and man up.
Dismissed!